Yes, so database are indeed very unappreciated topic, I think. I like to talk to people what with databases, you can compare that like, plumbing in your house. It is not quite sexy. That is not the first thing you come to think about when you're designing your house, right? But if it breaks, then that is a big problem, right? If somebody hits here some plumbing accidents, you guys know, and database are the same. That is something quite invisible, but it is very, very important to get right. Well, with that, I'm going to talk about the state of open source databases. And considering that is not the database conference, I thought I would focus more on the open source piece than a database piece, but look at that through my angle of open source database, because that is the environment where I work myself. So if I would ask you, what is the biggest thing impacting the open source right now? What do we see people talk a lot in the industry and so on? Anyone? Well, as I talk to the people, many would say that is a cloud. Cloud and open source, there's a lot of discussion about what is going on, how cloud impacts the open source. Is it going to kill open source as we know it, or empower open source? And I think what the cloud impacts open source in a very interesting way. From one way, it really allows to maximize and simplify adoption. A lot of projects out there was quite hard to adopt until we could really get it deployed in a cloud with a couple of clicks. But also it changes the opportunities in how cloud can be, how open source can be monetized, right? Because now a lot of monetization may belong to the cloud vendors compared to the traditional companies which has built open source. The thing is, I think the words from Martin Smikas, who was the CEO of MySQL IB, come as a very wise, is what the open source on its own is not a business model. You can think about that as a distribution model, development model, but that is not a business model, and it actually empowers many business models you can create in this space, and cloud impacts them in all the different way. So for example, one of the very interesting impacts of a cloud is pretty much hijacking the GPL license. Many vendors, such as MySQL, would say, well, you know what, if you want to build commercial applications on our products, you cannot use a GPL version, you have to buy the commercial license. Guess what? It does not work in the cloud, right? AWS and other cloud vendors are able to use and modify MySQL, building software like Amazon Aurora, and they don't have to pay Oracle, who is now a copyright holder for MySQL database, a dime for doing that, right? Things has changed. I think in this case, we also see a very different take based on how projects are governed. And if you really look at open source from the very high level, you can put the projects into two buckets. Some of them are foundation or association, wherever, governed, when you have many vendors coming together and no single commercial vendor controls it. Examples would be Postgres or Kubernetes, or most famously Linux. And then there are also a lot of open source projects, right? Think about the MySQL or Elastic, MongoDB, which are actually controlled by a single vendor. And I think that is their behavior and relationship with clouds are very different. If you think about the foundation-based open source projects, a lot of them are really loving is what cloud accelerates adoption. When I talk to PostgreSQL people, for example, they love what is happening out there, because with the help of AWS and Microsoft and Google and Alibaba, right, and countless of other cloud vendors, the PostgreSQL became that number one open source database. And the reason for that, I think, is partly because unlike with other vendors like MySQL, when Amazon promotes Postgres, they don't really promote the product of their competition. And of course, if you think about who captures majority of value for PostgreSQL, now that would be cloud vendors, not some big players in the PostgreSQL space, right? I don't know exact numbers, but I would imagine what AWS captures much more value in a PostgreSQL space compared to Enterprise DB, which is known to be the largest PostgreSQL contributor. And of course, in a single vendor space, you are really looking at a lot of public or venture-funded companies, right, which really are focused on the high growth and creating a lot of revenues, and they are disliking, maybe fearing that kind of cloud competition. And in fact, we actually see a lot of those vendors changing the license on a part or all of their software from the open source to something else, the class of, I would say, source available license. Now, if you think about the database systems, what is the main goal of those license changes? Well, I would say is making sure what they have monopoly on the database as a service market about that database technology. Like, why is that? Why does database as a service matter? And the database as a service matters because if you think about the databases, that is how you can use the databases the most simply, right? That is how a database are accessible for developers who want to focus on writing their application and they don't want to mess with database, have the ability figuring out how to do backups correctly and all the messy stuff like that. And a database as a service really provides that. Now, so what is the problem I see with that monopoly which is sought by a lot of those vendors in a database as a service space? Well, from my standpoint, if you think about many developers or other folks who are not database professionals, the database as a service is really the only way how they can consume a database. And if that is the only way they consume database, then monopoly on database as a service put us in the same shape as with a proprietary software before, right? From this standpoint, there is not a real difference with MongoDB Atlas or Oracle database, right? Which is sort of quintessential example of a proprietary database vendor in our market. Well, with that though, I think not all is lost. And that is, I think, where things are going to be changing. I was involved in open source pretty much since early 2000s. And I remember at that time in development, there was a lot of proprietary stacks, right? If you really looked for developer productivity, you will be often in kind of Microsoft ASP.NET, right, or something like that. But we see what's now open source cut up, and you can be very productive using open source development ecosystem. We are in a kind of the same situation right now, but with the cloud tools. You have a very easy to use, well-integrated cloud infrastructure from AWS or other big cloud vendors. This kind of reminds me what we saw a while back with Linux and Solaris. When I first started with Linux, I remember that was a toy operating system which couldn't even handle files more than 2 gigabytes. And was only 32-bit operation system. Oh my gosh, that is kind of was a joke, right? But then, well, where are we now, right? How many of you guys are still running Solaris here? Any hands? Well, not much, right? And I believe in this ability of open source to be catching up, and I think that is what is happening in the cloud ecosystem as well. While we have proprietary stacks for somebody like AWS, we also have a lot of work going on with a cloud native stack. There are a lot of solutions built around Kubernetes and the ecosystem. And I think that is actually taking us how cloud was initially intended to use. This is something which I pulled from the old AWS advertisement, which was comparing cloud to electricity. I think that is a great comparison because you know what? Electricity is commodity. You can buy it from pretty much any vendor and that is the same. And I believe that is a fantastic way how we can use the cloud as commodity infrastructure provider, right? And then create a value in the open source level. So if you speak about the database as a service and open source, well, do we have it now, right? Does it exist? And I would say what we do not have it yet, but we are, as a community, taking our baby steps. I think the most important thing which is driving that is the Kubernetes, which becomes ubiquitous API, or you can think about that as an operating system for your cloud, which is an API you can use for public cloud, private cloud, everywhere. And there is a framework or technology called Kubernetes operators, which really allows to provide that kind of experience. Now, if you look at the Kubernetes operators alone, they're not quite the same as a database as a service. Yes, they can remove a lot of toil, they can do backups for you and even kind of automatically upgrade the databases when security comes up. You can do that all in operator frameworks, but UX is kind of different, right? You don't just click the button and get a database provided. You have to, create and deploy some YAML files, right? So that is another step needed. Now, what is interesting, though, is the database, what we have right now in production, some of them, and I would argue increasing number of them, are built based on Kubernetes technology. Here is their sample of their vendors, which at some point at least stated what their database is powered by the Kubernetes inside. And I think that is fantastic because that shows us what there are tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of database nodes running in production on Kubernetes right now, and that can be done. Now, what those vendors have is not completely open source solution, right? A lot of management framework, right, or GUI is proprietary in this case. But I think that shows what the open source database as a service experience is possible. And we at Percona are frankly working on that, right? With this case, I don't think what we will be alone in this case, but we will be one of the companies who are going to do that as a part of our Percona monitoring management functionality. It is currently work in progress, right? But you folks are welcome to check it out and also contribute, which is always welcome for open source project. Now, with that, I also wanted to maybe ask you or point out one question, right? It's easy for me to come here and say, hey, preach, open source is wonderful, and let's do more open source. Let's not adopt those proprietary licenses. Let's do open source for real, right? But is that even possible, right? Or am I talking about some utopian thing? Well, I would say, but I am not just an open source advocate. I'm also a founder and CEO of a company, which, as Todd mentioned, has been doing open source for real for last 15 years. All software at Percona is open source. We don't have any open core or other proprietary software. And while we are not multi-billion dollar public company, we are at a pretty decent size and commercially successful, and really, I think, help a lot of people worldwide with our approach to open source. With that, that's all I had to say. Thank you.